Welcome back to the third Houdini tutorial from 9 Between, and today we'll be going over how to create this effect. Now, this rain effect has a few layers to it. Firstly, we'll be creating a pop network that emits particles, and from the collisions of those particles we'll emit a couple of things. Firstly, we'll do some splashes, and after that we'll do some running particles that run along the surface of the object. Next, we'll copy geometry to all of those points, and then finally we'll create a wet map. So, hope you enjoy. In Houdini, let's begin by dropping down a geometry node. Alt click and drag this node to duplicate it. First we'll rename our Geo1 node to Rain, and our Geo2 node we'll rename to Collider. Dive inside of this Collider node and delete that file node. Next, we'll drop down a rubber toy, and this will be our test geometry. So next we'll drop down a null, plug that into our null, and rename this null Collider_out. Jump back up, dive inside of our Rain node, and let's drop down a grid. This grid will be emitter for our particles, so we can just resize this to a 5x5 grid and move it up 5 units on the y-axis. Next we'll drop down a pop network and plug this grid into the first input. Dive inside this pop network, give ourselves some space by dragging down this output node, and in between our pop solver and output node we'll drop a gravity force, and in between our gravity force and our pop solver we'll drop down a merge. Next we'll need to merge in our collider, so we'll create a static object and merge that in. And on our merge node, let's switch these inputs because left input affects right, and we want our colliders to affect our rain. So on the static object, go to your subpath, go to your collider, and choose collider out. As you can see, it brings it into the scene. Now, we don't actually have an accurate representation of our collision, and we can see this by going to our collisions tab and activating the collision guide. If we hide our geometry, we can see that this is a very inaccurate representation, and we need reasonably accurate representations of our geometry if we are to be doing things like splashes and running of water. So we'll up the uniform divisions to 80, and then go over to our physical and increase the friction up to 100. We can hide our collision and display our geometry again. Now we can begin on actually creating the rain. So once again give ourselves some space by dragging this up here and pulling our merge node down. On our pop source, we'll go over to the birth tab, and as you can see we have it set as 5000 for now, and that'll be good, but we can change it if your computer cannot handle a high particle count. So we can drop this to 2000 for now. And if we play this back, you'll see we have particles falling from our grid. Go down to your timeline and activate the real-time toggle so it plays back in real time. And one thing you'll notice are these lines that form. And the reason we have these lines is because when we have fast-moving particles and they move a large distance between two frames, Houdini does not account for that travel. So we end up with these strange artifacts of lines appearing. To get rid of that, we can increase our substeps by diving up and going onto our pop network, going to our simulation tab and increasing the substeps to 5. We dive back inside, we'll have sorted out our issue. So the next thing to do is to drop a pop collision behavior. Plug that in. And we'll give this a group name of hit group. Now, the pop collision behavior node checks whether particles are interacting with a collider, such as hitting it, and then we can do particular things with that. So in this case, we're adding it to a hit group, and we're also coloring those particles red. But when we play this back, you'll notice that these particles aren't getting colored red. So on our pop solver, if we go to collision behavior, you'll notice that there's this add hit attributes toggle. So if we activate that and then go back, we'll notice that now our particles are turning red. If you can't see that, you just press D, go to geometry and increase your point size to 10. And now you can see that we have some particles that are turning red. So that proves that we have particles colliding and those collisions are being registered. So what would we like to do with those particles? Well, first, we'd like to have a response. And we'd like these particles to die on impact. But now we have a group that we can work with, called hit group. So we'll be using that shortly. First, let's keep working on our current particle setup. So next, we'll drop down a pop wrangle. And in this pop wrangle, we'll just say @bounce equals 1. Next, we'll drop down a pop wind with an air resistance of 0.5, an amplitude of 1, and a swirl size of 5. And what that will give us is some general movement in our pops. Now we have particles that move gently, and that emulates rain quite well. Next, we'll drop down a pop group. And this pop group will be called main. Call it main, activate preserve group, and enable this rule. Now the reason we're grouping these particles is because once we leave our popnet, we would like to have access to the particles that are falling so that we can attach a geometry to each point. So the last thing that we need to do for this first stream is to drop down a pop kill node. We'll place it after our merge, and we'll use a bounding box. So enable bounding. And what we would like to do is kill all particles below our collider. So we'll drop the center to -2 on the y-axis, and we'll give it a size of 10 by 1 by 10. Now any particles that fall beyond our collider will be killed. That saves space during our simulation. Now we can go on to creating our splashes. So we'll be using a pop stream. And we'll use our source group that we created called hit group. So what this does is it creates a new stream of particles based on a group. And we already have this group that we created with the pop collision behavior. So when particles collide with our geometry, they get sent into this stream. So in this stream, we can run a pop replicate. So plug the stream into this first input of your pop replicate. And we'll go over here to the constant activation, switch it off, turn down our constant birth rate, and give it an impulse count of 5. Next we'll go down here, just change our life expectancy to 0.25. And what that'll do is as particles hit, we'll emit 5 particles and have a lifespan of 0.25. So we can plug this in to see what that looks like. Now as you can see, we have these particles colored red, but they appear to be emitting in a large area. And the reason for that is under this shape tab, we have this shape sphere. Now we would rather have our points emitted from a single point of impact rather than from a sphere. So change this to point. Now when we play it back, upon impact, we'll be emitting 5 points. Now the velocity is still too high, so go over to your attributes and use add to inherited velocity, set that to 0.25. Our radial velocity we'll set to 1, and we'll put 0.5 variance on each axis. Once again, play that back. And now we have particles that splash upon impact. And the reason they colored red is because they're inheriting all attributes from this first stream from the group called hit group. And hit group we still have colored red. So we don't have to color our hits. We can switch that off. And that'll do for our splashing. Next we need to just do a few things to this pop stream. So we'll drop down a wrangle. And once again, we'll say at bounce equals 1. And then we'll do a pop group. This pop group we will call splash. Once again preserving the group and enabling the rule. And so now this stream will all be grouped into the splash group, while the first stream will all be grouped into the main group. Now we can move on to creating our running effect. Because now we have particles that splash upon impact, we would like particles that run down the surface upon impact. To do this, we'll be dropping down a pop stream. And once again, we'll activate the source group and call the hit group. Next, we'll drop down a pop replicate node and plug our pop stream into the first input. Now we won't be using constant activation and we won't be using constant birth rate, but we will be using impulse count, and we'll set that to 1. And what that'll do is, upon impact, it'll emit 1 point based on our hit group. So next, we can drop its life expectancy to 0.05. And once again, we would like it upon the point of impact, so set that to point. And in our attributes, we won't inherit anything. We'll set our initial velocity to 0.1 on each axis. So now that we have that set up, what this will do is, as a point collides with geometry, a new point will be emitted at that point that has a life expectancy of 0.05. So what we'll be doing with that is spawning points off of that in our next pop stream, and that will run down the surface. So this is just setting where we want those streams of water to be running from. So we can go ahead and drop down a pop wrangle. And this pop wrangle, same as before, we'll do at bounce equals 0 this time. And the reason for that is we don't want these particles to bounce off of the surface. We want them to stick. And Houdini recognizes this bounce attribute within pop networks. So we can't just call it straight at bounce equals 0. Next, let's drop down a pop collision behavior again. Plug this in to our pop collision behavior. And we'll give this group name run spawn. Once again, we'll preserve the group. We won't be coloring the hits, and this time, as a response, we'll make them stick to the surface. So we can go ahead and plug this into our merge node, and begin on our last stream. So create another pop stream, and another pop replicate. Plug our pop stream into the first input of our replicate, and let's go to our pop stream. Once again, source group will activate, but this time we'll be using the group that we created in our second stream. And that was called run spawn. Over here, we'll just say run spawn. And now we can go on to our pop replicate. So on our pop replicate, we'll do an impulse of 1, no activation, no birth rate, or constant. And we'll give it a life expectancy of 3. Next, we'll go on to our shape. And for shape, we actually don't want them emitted from a single point. We like them with some variance. So we'll emit from 0.01. That's just the scale of the sphere that it's emitting from. Next, we can go over to our attributes, and we won't inherit any of the attributes. We won't inherit velocity. We'll just set our initial velocity to 0.1, and that'll be the variance. So next, you can go ahead and drop down another angle, and again, we'll say at bounce equals 0. Then we can drop down a pop property. Plug this in here. And what a pop property is used for is for initializing attributes that Houdini recognizes. So the one that we'll be using is on the Dynamics tab, and it's called Cling. So we'll set a cling of 100. And what that'll do is, it will make the particles stick to the surface of a geometry. This over here is just the strength to which it clings. And this will be different depending on your geometry and what kind of rain effect you're going for, but I find 100 works quite well. Next we can go ahead and drop down a pop collision behavior. Plug your property into this collision behavior, and this group name will be called run. We can color these hits to see what they look like, so we'll make them light blue. And this one will be using slide as a response. And again, we'll be preserving our group as we've done before. And the next thing that we'll do is we'll drop a pop interact. We'll do a position force of minus 0.2 and a velocity force of 0.2. Now what this does is position force is a force used to push particles apart. If we make it a negative force, it becomes a force that pulls particles together. And rain tends to gather, so we would like this to be a force that pulls particles together, but not too much of a force that they immediately clump. So negative 0.2 is a decent number to work with. Velocity force causes particles that are nearby to each other to blur their velocity. So they tend to share velocities, and so that replicates droplets of rain quite well. Next thing that we'll do is we'll drop down a pop drag, and on this pop drag we'll set it to 10, and then we can finally plug this pop drag into our merge node, press Alt to lay everything out, set our display flag on our output, and play this back to see what happens. So if you look closely, we have these light blue particles that slide down the surface. Once again, press D, bring up your point size, and we can take a look at what's happening now. So when we play this back, you'll notice some particles hitting and rolling off of the surface. And that more or less looks like droplets of rain. So what we'll do is we'll jump up out of this network, drop down a file cache node, plug our popnet into this, and let's find a place to save our rain cache. So I'll go over here to my rain tot, create a new folder called cache, and in here we'll call this rain particles $ff.bgeo.sc. So $ff, once again, that's the corresponding frame to save, because if we don't have this, it'll only save one file, and we'd rather have a sequence saved. .bgeo.sc is what I found to be the best file type for saving geometry from popnet, so that's what we'll be using for this one. And we can switch on load from disk, so that once it's saved to disk, it won't be calling this every time, but rather just fetching from our file cache. And the last thing that we'd like to do before we actually cache this out is to increase the number of particles that we're using. We can go to our pop source, increase this to 5000, and finally we'll save this to disk. Then, once our particles are cached out, we can begin copying geometry to these points. So we'll drop down a sphere, set our display flag on the sphere, change it to a polygon mesh, we'll change its rows to 5 and its columns to 8. And that gives us a faceted sphere. So the next thing that we'll do is we'll drop down an edit node, go over here, select this top point, and we'll move it up, just until this resembles a raindrop. Next, we can drop a copy to points, and we can plug our rain particles into this. Now currently it's copying to the collider geometry that we've brought in, So we need to just choose which points we would like our sphere to be copied to. So over here, we can choose our main points. And if you remember, those are the ones in our popnet that are just falling. We have a splash group, we have a run group, and we have this main group. So for this one, we'll use the main group. And if you copy to points, these points are currently massive. So to fix that, we'll drop down an attribute wrangle between our file cache and our copy to points. In here, we'll do two things. Firstly, we'll say @orient equals v at v. And then we'll say @pscale equals 0.01. And we've got a semicolon. There we go. So what that does is this orient equals v at v sets our orientation of our particles to face the direction of our velocity. So if we have velocity moving slightly to the side, as you can see on a lot of these points, then they'll face that direction. And so that just gives it a bit of variation and makes it a lot more accurate in terms of how it looks. Then our p-scale is just setting the scale of our points. So we can change this depending on the scene. So I think for the angel I use 0.005. And then I just up the amount of particles that we had. But we'll keep this at 0.01 for now, just so we can see. Alright, we can drop down a null after that. Plug that in there, rename this null main underscore out. Next we can move on to working with our splashes. So we'll drop down another sphere, set our display flag to it again. Once again set it to a polygon mesh. This time we'll do 3 rows and 4 columns. And then we'll drop down our copy to points, plug it into the first input, and plug our file cache into the second input. On this copy to points, once again, we'll choose the correct group, and this time we'll be using the splash group. So we can set our display flag, and once again these points are massive. So to correct that, another attribute wrangle between our copy to points and our file cache. And the reason that we put this attribute wrangle over here is because copy to points, when it copies your geometry to these points, your geometry inherits these attributes. So your sphere, in each case, would inherit your orientation and your p-scale. So you can make it inherit other things, such as color and an up attribute. Whatever you needed to inherit, you can inherit through here. So we'll continue here and do @pscale equals 0.005. So these points will be slightly smaller than our other points. And then again we can drop down a null and call this one splash underscore out. So if you take a look, we can just hide this flippy collider. He's in a separate node. We just hide other objects. And now we can see what's happening with our splashes. We're instancing these points to all of the splash points. Now our final node is our run group. So this one we'll be doing slightly differently. Let's drop a delete node. We would like to delete everything except for run. So exclamation run, change this to points. There we go. Now we have only the run particles. So what we can do with this is we can drop down a VDV from particles. VDV from particles. There we go. Plug your delete node into the first input. And you end up with this blobby mess. The reason for that is just our voxel size and our point radius scale. So we'll begin by dropping our point radius scale, drop it down to 0.0035, drop our minimum radius down to 0.1, and then our voxel size will drop down to 0.005. The reason I did it in that order is because a lot of the time when you decrease your voxel size on this VDV from particles node, without changing your point radius scale, you can really slow down the process. These two should be as close to each other as possible. And if you want accurate representations, you'll drop this slightly lower than your point radius scale, but in this case, it's fine. So the next thing that we'll do is we'll drop down a convert VDB. And we'll convert from volume to polygons. And as you can see, we now have these tiny droplets, and they may be a bit too small, so we can just increase the size of our point radius scale to 0.05. Sorry, 0.005. And one other thing that you can do on your VDB from particles node is change your particle footprint. So you can change this from spherical to velocity trail. And as you can see, it goes quite crazy, and the reason for that is just our settings over here. But we can make this work, so all you have to do is change your multiplier to 0.01 and your velocity spacing to 0.2. And it creates a slight trail. So the last thing that you'll need to do is you'll need to transfer your velocity. So we'll drop down an attribute transfer node, plug your convert VDB into the first input. Now what we'll be doing here is taking the points from our delete node and feeding the velocity back in. Because you'll notice something on this convert VDB node, we don't have our velocity anymore. And the reason for that is when you're converting to a VDB, you're losing all of your attributes. So we don't have any of those attributes anymore, so we'll have to transfer them back on. So under the attributes points, we'll just select V. We'll change our distance to 0.2, drop down a null, plug this into our null, and we'll call this one run_out. And once you've done that, you can merge all of these together and take a look at what we have. So you'll notice a few things, such as these particles being too big, but that's all up to you. You can make changes to that. So you can go over here and change our p-scale to 0.05. Perhaps you want them smaller. And the reason that we use these round droplets as opposed to a longer geometry is because we will be rendering this, or you would be rendering this with velocity, and you would be using motion blur. And so these particles would blur in a streak. So you don't have to have geometry that looks like rain, you just need something that merely resembles it. So once you have that, you can just drop down a normal node, drop down your final null, and call this one rain_out. And there you have it. So if we jump up a level and show our geometry, we can play this back and take a look at what happens. We have our particles splashing, and we have some running down the surface. And of course you can tweak all of these settings if you'd like to change this. And of course this isn't exactly what I used for the angel render, but it's more or less the same. So you can get the same effect that I got on the angel, just with a few tweaks. The last thing that we'll be doing is adding a wet map. To create the wet map, we'll be using an infection solver. And it will be the one that Ben Watts uses. It's quite similar to the one seen in my Phoenix disintegration video, but the one that Ben Watts does is all in VOPs, and it's quite useful to have another approach to it. I do quite like his setup, so thanks to Ben Watts for that tutorial, and I'll be linking that in the description if you want to check that out. So let's dive inside of our collider node, drop down a scatter, plug our collider out into the scatter1 node, and we'll push up our total count to 8,000. Next, we'll drop down an object merge, and over here we'll merge in our file cache from our rain node. Find our file cache, and next we'll be dropping a delete node. Plug your object merge into this delete node. And what we'll be deleting from this is our collider, because our file cache cached the collider as well, and we don't want to use that. So all we'll have to do on this delete node is remove this exclamation. And there we go, that removes all primitives from our object merge. So now we only have points. Next, we can drop down an attribute wrangle. And over here, we'll say @wet equals 0.1. We can copy over this attribute wrangle to this side of our scatter node. And then on this attribute wrangle, we'll say @wet equals 0. Now we have two attribute wrangles, each initializing our wet attribute. So the next thing that we'll do is drop down a solver. Into the first input, we'll plug our scatter node. And second input, we'll take our object merge. Now we can dive inside of our solver and drop down a point var. Into the first input of our point var, we'll plug our previous frame, and second input, we'll be taking our input 2. Dive inside of our point var, and we'll be dropping a few things. First, a point cloud open, and we can just duplicate that by holding Alt and dragging. Now we'll plug our P attribute into the corresponding inputs of our PC opens. And into the file input of our PC open 1, we'll plug up input 1, and up input 2 will go into our PC open 2 file input. Next thing to do is to drop a PC filter and plug the handle into the filter. Duplicate the filter and plug the corresponding handle into our second filter. Now on both of these filters, we'll have to change the signature and the channel. So we'll change our signature to float, and the channel that we're looking for is that wet attribute that we created. So what this does is it opens a point cloud, and within the cloud, it looks for this attribute. And so we can do things depending on proximity from this point cloud to this point cloud. And what we'll do is we'll add attributes. So we'll add the current wet attribute that we have to the existing wet attribute. Then we'll drop down a bind export and plug that in. On this bind export, we will rename this to wet so that it re-exports our wet attribute. So it adds the two wet attributes together and then re-exports them. We can also plug this into our CD attribute so we can see what's happening. And then on our PC open, we have a couple of settings, but we'll get back to those shortly. What we would like to do is just fit this. So we'll fit our range between 0 and 1. And the reason for that is it will add indefinitely and may go over 1, but we want it clamped to just fit 1. So next, we'll just plug this fit node into our CD, make sure that it's plugged into our input of our bind export. We can jump up a level and play this back to see what happens. So as you can see, it's gaining an attribute. And if you remember correctly, our attribute for wet is corresponding to our CD attribute. So as this turns white, that represents our object getting wet. This value for wet is being transferred onto these points. And that's great, but it's getting transferred onto too many points too quickly. So we'll make a few minor adjustments. We'll change our search radius down to 0.05 on both of our PC opens, and change the number of points down to 5. When we play that back, you'll now see that works quite well. The only other thing that you may want to do is add some sort of drying effect, and you can do that by dividing or blurring this attribute for the wet value every frame. So we can do that by going back into our point var. And on this first input, if you remember correctly, this is the previous frame. So this fetches the wet attribute of the previous frame. So what we can do with that is we can drop down a divide constant. And every frame, just divide this slightly. So we'll divide by 1.05, go up a level, and you can see what that does. So as it gets wet, it also dries or absorbs moisture slightly. So once we have this, we can drop down and transfer attribute, plug our collider out into the first input, and our solver into the second input. And what we'll be transferring from here is simply our wet attribute. So now that we have our wet attribute on our original geometry, we can do a few things with that. So we'll drop down an attribute wrangle and plug this into the first input. Firstly, we can say @cd equals channel ramp, so chramp. We'll just call this CLR for color, comma, and then we need a driving force. So we'll use our wet attribute, so that's @wet. And then we can create our spare parameters. Go up to our edit parameter interface. And this color node will just be changing the ramp type from float to color, apply and accept. Now something that you'll notice, if we just add an extra color over here, is that we can have this attribute control our color. And that's great because wet areas often appear darker on objects. And of course that depends on the object you're working with. If you're working with something like glass, you won't need that. But things like cement, or that angel that I was working on, cement would get darker as it gets wetter. So what we can do is just flip this around and set the first value to white and the last input to black. And what that will do is darken the areas that are wet. And you can slide these around if you want it to look more wet in more places. And you don't have to have this as pitch black. You just have that as a gray. Now areas get wet as the water hits. And the last thing that we would like to do is change the roughness. So what we would like is for the wet areas to be shinier. So we can say @rough equals channel ramp. And in these inverted commas, we'll say rough. That's what we'll call our ramp. And once again, it will be driven by wet. So we can create spare parameters. And now we have this roughness ramp. Now, an attribute value of 1 means that something is entirely rough and has no shine to it. So we'll invert this. We'll just bring this up to about halfway, and we'll drop this down to almost 0. So we'll do 0.05. And you won't be able to see it in this view, but when you render out, all the areas that are wet will be shinier. So that's all you actually need to get this wet map working. And of course you can make changes to your ramps, and that will change how it looks when it's rendered. So we can jump back up and take a look at the two of these together. And you can go ahead and render this out. What you would have to do is activate your motion blur on your particles and in your camera settings. And once again, that's covered in our other tutorials. It's covered in our Doctor Strange portal effect tutorial. And you can apply a glass shader to these particles, and that should work. So that's all for this tutorial. Thanks for watching, and be sure to give me feedback. We'll be releasing a lot more tutorials in the coming weeks. We have really exciting things coming up. We have a lightning tutorial, we have a Rubik's Cube tutorial, we have some geo-effector things that we're doing, and we even have a Carnage symbiote coming up. So stay tuned for all of that. Once again, thanks for watching.